Hello there, and welcome to the latest video in our series of conversations where I sit down and talk to people who are passionate about the past and work on different aspects of it from different approaches. And today I'm delighted to say we've got Saul David to come on the channel. And many of you will know him already from his many books and also his frequent appearances on TV. And then he and Patrick Bishop run a podcast, the Battleground podcast, where they look at contemporary warfare, but also historical examples as well. So he's one of the great writers, communicators, as well as scholars of military history of our generation. So he does a lot of things, and it's all very well coming up with very clever ideas, but if you can't convey them to anybody else, then it matters less. So there aren't too many of us that sort of bridge these different approaches to things and live in those different worlds. After all, he's taught academic courses as well as writing for the more general readership, the same sort of readership that I aim for. His interest, his focus is much more modern than my work, so he has written, I think, almost entirely on the 19th and 20th centuries. There's a little bit with his book on the British Army that goes back to the Restoration, so the latter part of the 17th century. But in the main, there's a lot of Victorian stuff. There's books on the Indian Mutiny, the Zulu War, Victoria's Wars, which is a particular favourite of mine, that covers the first part of Victoria's reign. And one of those odd things I noticed as one of these people who's obsessive enough to sit down and watch all the documentaries that came with, I don't know, whether it was the Blu-rays or whatever, of the Peter Jackson's Hobbit films, that in one of them, one of the actors is actually carrying a copy of Victoria's Wars and must have been reading it. I think when they go and meet, a couple of them go to meet Christopher Lee when he was filming his scenes in a studio in Britain, because he could, by that stage, too elderly to travel out to New Zealand. I thought, that's quite a claim to fame that you've got your book there. So we'll talk a lot about that, but we'll also talk in particular about his work on the Second World War, which I think has been one of those themes that he's started with and keeps coming back to. In particular, his latest book, Tunisgrad, which I heartily recommend. I finished it just a few weeks ago, and it was one of those books that I didn't realize I needed until I read it, because over the years I've read quite a bit about Tunisia and the 1942-43 campaign, Operation Torch, and that followed, and my father had been a part of it, a small part, as an apprentice in the Merchant Navy, and had landed there. I remember talking to another old boy in my local church who'd been in the RAF in a unit there as well. So I knew bits, and I'd read lots of unit histories, I've read accounts of individuals, but I didn't have anything that really fitted it all together and put it in proper perspective and got the distances and the chronology of it all, the details straight in my mind, as well as what it all meant. So it's a marvellous book for doing that, as one of these. We all know a bit about it, but even if you're an enthusiast for the Second World War, you probably don't know quite as much as you might say about D-Day and the subsequent fighting, about the Battle of the Bulge, the big moments, the big incidents that tend to draw our attention. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about how he approaches his work, both in choosing topics, but also the nature of research and the way that's changed from the early days when he was starting, when there was still a lot of Second World War veterans around to interview, talk to face, to the situation now where hardly anyone is left from that generation, and certainly nobody from the more senior ranks. They've all gone by now, and even those who are still alive are now very elderly and tended to be inevitably of a more junior rank when they were taking part in these momentous events. And obviously, whilst I'm sure for many the memories are as fresh in their mind as ever, for others they've told the stories so often, it's again, you start to wonder, well, can you preserve that clear memory absolutely sharply decades and decades later, when so many things have happened in between and you've learnt more about it and you've understood things, or you've talked to others who were there as well. And again, that's the sort of question that only those who were there could answer, because the rest of us weren't. But it's an interesting thing. So we talk about a range of things. We talk about his approach. We also get to talk about the book he's working on at the moment that sounds absolutely fascinating. So without more ado, and as usual, this introduction has been a bit more rambling and less focused than I intend it to be, but that's, those familiar with the channel will know how things work here, I'm afraid. I'm unlikely ever to get organised completely, but I hope it's natural. And the idea of these videos is that to make you feel as if you're just sitting down with us over a cup of tea and having a good chat about history and about the things we care about the things that fascinate us. And if we can pass on some sense of why we find this so intriguing, why we find this so addictive almost, that you just want to know more. You want to understand what was really going on, what it was like, what were the big things, what were the small things, the context, the meaning of it all, and try just to understand it and to hear about these things and remember with respect what went on. So all of that, hopefully, if we can give some sense of why we do it, then these videos have served their purpose. So without much more ado, we'd like to introduce the video for today. Well, today I'm delighted to welcome Saul David for the latest in our series of conversations. And you've already had the introduction, so I won't go back over all the many things he's written. But I did discover, as I was trying to put together slides for this to go up, trying to fit all the book covers into even several pages is quite a challenge. So I probably will have missed a few, to which apologies. But nevertheless, we'll put the link up to your website as well. There you can find all the details for that, and to the Battleground podcast. Is that the
Battleground
title?
Battleground.
I'm always terrible at remembering the names. I know you do it with Patrick Bishop, but I can't remember what it's called. So anyway, thank you so much for coming on today.
Pleasure, Adrian. I mean, we've known each other for a long time, as you know. We still have an on-off professional relationship. You occasionally giving lectures to my military history club, so it's great fun to come on, and you know, and all power to your elbow to doing this, because as we were discussing before we started recording, YouTube really does seem to be the way people are getting their messages across history and otherwise these days.
Well, hopefully it helps, and it's good that, you know, if there's an interest out there, then there's the whole range of the very introductory to the more detailed out there. But the thing that frightened me is, while I was preparing for this, I looked up when Time Commanders was filmed, and that was back in 2003. They showed that. So
yeah, I was driving along today actually thinking about that, because I knew you were going to mention that. I thought, when was that? I mean, that's more than 20 years ago, Adrian. And if you don't mind me saying, I mean, we'll no doubt have a few viewers disagreeing, but actually, if you look at pictures of us 20 years ago, I don't think either of us have changed that much. I know that sounds very modest to say that, but
I think I probably looked old for my years.
Oh, maybe you did back in the day. Yeah, possibly me too.
It's when you get these people who say, "Oh yes, I used to watch that with my granddad or my grandmother," and they're now, you know, 35 or something with children of their own. But it's not, it doesn't work. I did show it to my son, who said, "Oh yeah, that's all right," but it doesn't mean the same to them. Well, I did get him playing Rome Total War a couple back during the lockdown. I got that out on the laptop, and when we were at the beach, he was talking about, you know, building sandcastles, throwing pebbles at it, and oh, there go the Carthaginians and all this sort of stuff. And had people known, they would probably have assumed that it was because of me as father, but actually it was just Time Commanders that he'd quite like watching on YouTube for a bit. Anyway, that's, as I say, one step back into the past. But to go even further, you've written, I suppose, primarily on 19th, 20th century, but sometimes you've gone a bit earlier as well. Where did it all start for you? How did the young Saul suddenly think history is interesting, military history is interesting? How did it all begin?
I think, you know, we often wonder how we get into careers, and I'd love to think, you know, there's a certain amount of choice involved in all of this, but I think really, when it comes down to it, I was trying to get my father's attention, Adrian. He was an interesting character, quite charismatic, but difficult to get to know. Wasn't always around that much. I don't think I was alone in having a parent that was like that, father that was like that. But he loved military history. As an amateur, read very widely, and the typical conversation around the dinner table would have been about a battle, a character, some element of conflict, usually the sharp end of conflict. I'm personally fascinated with all of it, as I know you are. I mean, the whole social aspect of things, you know, what's happening on the home front is as significant. You know, forthcoming books are going to be covering that more than I've probably done in the past. But in any case, to have a chance to get his attention at all, you had to sort of do a bit of prep work yourself. So I started reading both fiction and non-fiction from a relatively early age. I mean, I suppose I was a bit of an oddball in that sense, but I suspect a lot of us who've become professional historians, you could say the same thing about. I do remember one conversation with my father about Rommel, and I've recently been writing about Rommel. In fact, Rommel comes into my current book, and Rommel, of course, is someone who had quite a how can I put it, an enthusiastic reception, even among British servicemen, both during the Second World War and certainly people interested in military history afterwards. And he was very cross that I was trying to big up Monty and trying to say, well, actually, you've got to understand, Monty came in at a time when morale was very low for the Eighth Army. And he said, yes, 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 but in the Battle of El Alamein, he had twice as much as everything. He wasn't anywhere near as good a commander. So I think he lacked the sort of, the sophistication that you can only get when you drill down into history yourself. And maybe I instinctively realized that in these early conversations and thought it's one thing reading about it, but it's another thing actually being a historian, looking at the original material. And I think I got the interest in the bug quite early on. And the last thing to say about that, Adrian, because I know we've got a lot of other things to discuss, is a conversation with a 16-year-old friend who said to me, what do you think you'll do for a living? And I said, well, I'm going to write history. And she said, yes, I know you love history, but how are you going to make a living? And my answer was, that's what I'm going to do. And it was a relatively unusual thing. And I wasn't thinking of becoming an academic. I did, of course, do some postgraduate work later on and have taught on and off. But that was never the plan. I was always going to research and write history.
I didn't know anybody who made a living writing it. So it's one of those weird things, is that while like you, I've written some novels and I keep doing so and it's fun. I sort of had this, I thought, well, maybe the only way I can make a living is to write novels, and perhaps then I'll have enough spare time to write history books and this sort of thing. And then it didn't pan out that way, in that people started asking me to write the nonfiction. And it just, one book led to another because the publishers liked it. And I didn't, apart from the not getting a permanent job university-wise, I wasn't really sure I wanted to do that. It's nice world to visit, but I'm not sure it's the world where I'd like to live all the time, because it gets a little bit. I perhaps put it this way. I remember having this conversation with Harry Sidebottom, who's written his novels very successfully, and he was saying once, we were talking about an article that one or the other of us had written, and working out that we probably would have already met or will meet in our life absolutely everybody who will read that thing, because maybe it'll be a few dozen at the most, or 100 if you're really getting wild, but something in a journal somewhere. And it's nice thinking that you're talking to a bigger audience, that people are genuinely interested in this. So I think I sort of stumbled. I certainly wasn't as focused or as clear to that. But then I suppose my father was very keen on the Elizabethans. He loved history, but it was very much that period. He read lots about that, and I must confess, it always leaves me a bit cold, so I don't quite know what happened there. Whereas his stories about being in the army after the war, in the Merchant Navy during the war, and some of the other, he had a small shop, so these old boys would appear who'd been in India, and there's a fellow who's a tail gunner on Whitley's and this sort of thing, and they'd tell stories, and they'd tell the sanitized ones when the kids were around. So you got the impression of something that was really rather fun, and that it was funny and exciting, and they did all these exotic things. So yes, I don't know. It's but again, it's that individual path. So from there, you went and studied, and then did a doctorate. And did you feel which period you were going to look at first, or how did that come along?
Well, my first couple of books were before my doctorate, actually. I don't know if I've mentioned this to you before, Adrian. I had quite an unusual path, really. I mean, going back to my determination to write history,
Yeah.
I came out of Emory University with a degree in history, but, along with quite a few other people, and that hardly set me apart. But then I got a job as a journalist because I wanted to learn how to write. I knew that, I had a reasonable feel for language. I think all of us have to have a little bit of kind of raw talent.
You don't really get at university, so especially the higher up you go, where it's discouraged, if anything.
Exactly. And I felt that, a decent turn of phrase, the ability to write with brevity. I do remember quite a few undergraduate essays, one in particular, which I was most put out about. I mean, the mark was actually very good, but the criticism was wordy and verbose, which struck me as tautological. I think it certainly is, So I don't know whether that was ironic from the lecture. I'd like to think it was. I suspect it wasn't. But in any case, I wanted to learn how to write, and then started working on a first book about the Second World War. So I did actually start with the Second World War. A lot of people who read my books for the first time think that I mainly wrote in the 19th century, Indian Mutiny, Zulu, Victoria's Wars.
Yeah.
But actually, I'd already had a few books under my belt. That was before I did my PhD and before I got any real presence, I suppose, certainly in the general history marketplace, because I was writing for relatively small presses. But in terms of cutting my teeth, it was a really useful process because, well, first point is a lot of eyewitnesses were still around in the early 1990s when I started. And of course, if you're working on the Second World War now, which I am still, or at least I've come back to it, there's pretty much no one left to interview directly. So you're relying on other things, which I'm sure we'll discuss about sources. But I was really spoilt for choice. But and yet at the same time in the early 90s with my first couple of books about what happened to the Highland Division in 1940 at St. Valery. And then following on from that, of course, it's interesting.
Sorry to interrupt. I noticed that one and I thought, I haven't read that, but I'd really like to. So that's now on the list, because I remember... Was there a documentary as well? I remember one about the mutiny at Salerno.
Yeah, there was a documentary about the mutiny at Salerno, which came. I mean, again, it was a very, very small press. I think the press was pretty sure it was Brassey's, who don't exist anymore.
No, like a lot of them.
But actually, they did a terrific production job on the book. The terms of payment were appalling, as you can imagine, Adrian. These small publishing houses. And this was pre-agent days, actually, so you're even more likely to be squeezed. But the production values were very good, and it meant that I could truck around the country interviewing really a significant number of people. I think about 150 people I interviewed who would have been in their 70s. So you can see that sort of book, and I was determined for it as my first book. I was going to really go to town. Spent a lot of time in the National Archives where a lot of the original material was. Tried to get as many first-hand accounts of people who were no longer with us, or even diaries from people who'd perished in the Second World War from the various archives in the UK. So I really went to town on that book, trying to get some of the German side of things as well, because it's ironically, having just mentioned Rommel turns out to be the military commander. He's then in charge of the 7th Ghost Panzer Division that captures the Highland Division, or at least a big chunk of it at St. Valery. So, at least I had a bit of name recognition there, and I was trying to get some of the German sources, not very successfully actually, but I had an enormous amount of oral history, is probably the best way I'll put it. And you then have to obviously find a way to break that down and fit that into your narrative. But it was it was a wonderful experience as a first book. And I also didn't fall into the trap, although I would have happily fallen into this trap if I'd been offered, which is having a first book that sold a lot of copies and then always having to match that, because it was modest sales. It was solid sales, certainly in Scotland. I was on the front page of Scotland on Sunday, I seem to remember. Churchill, to blame for the loss of the Highland Division. But it was onwards and upwards from that point onwards.
Right. So that's. I was wondering, because, as I say, I remember that, and I think that's the first time I sort of knew your name and saw, and because again, it's one of those. I've always had a keen interest in the Second World War, but less formally and less in terms of studying. And it's you tend to go to the highlights. So it's things like, obviously for us, in Britain, it's 1940 is very much up until Dunkirk, and once that's over, you forget about 51st Division and the is it the 1st Armoured that's out there as well, and and other bits and pieces that
known and also wonderful character. Of course, he goes on to be Chief of Imperial General Staff. Is Alan Brooke, who's sent out there by Churchill to command the second BEF, as it's known. I mean, story's almost unknown. I remember when Hugh Sebag Montefiore was writing his Dunkirk book, he said, "Please give me some of your research for the Highland Division, because I really want to, to tell a little bit of that story." And he does do that actually in his book. So other than me, and obviously I'm not the only person to have written about the story of the Highland Division, but in terms of getting it to a slightly broader audience, I think Hugh is one of the only people who's done that. And it's a fascinating story, because the political element of desperately trying to keep the French in the fight comes into play. My argument in Churchill's Sacrifice, or after Dunkirk, I think, as it's been rebranded more recently, was, well, it was obvious they were never going to stay in the fight anyway. And Alan Brooke was telling Churchill that even before he sent out to France. So really, this was an unnecessary sacrifice, because these were good men from the Highlands of Scotland. And of course, the territorial division, you lose whole communities in one sweep.
And the vast majority went into the prisoner of war camps, didn't they? And then not going to be home till 1945. So I remember reading a memoir of a small group that got into Spain, managed to get. Again, it was one of those a memoir that happened to be about this, so that you thought, oh yes, I reminded. But so you sort of started Second World War, and that's always the big thing then, but there's also, you know, things about Cardigan, about the mutiny. The Victorian element's been quite a lot. And I must give a shout out to Victoria's Wars, just because as a Flashman fan, it's essentially the sort of the historical companion to that, because it covers nearly all the books up until you go up to China, don't you? I think so. It's about 1860-ish.
China. And I was intending to, Adrian, take it all the way through, and for reasons which we needn't go into, the publishers decided this wasn't really a 2-volume project. They'd hope I'd do it in one, but I'd said, you know, it's going to be difficult. So we only told the story up to Albert's death, which is a shame. But you know, you've hit the nail on the head. I was also a reader of Flashman as a young boy. I was talking about the fiction, and if I was reading fiction, it was probably Flashman. And I absolutely, without question, my third book. So I do 2 books on the Second World War. The second one was Mutiny at Salerno, which came out of the first one, as so many of our books do. You know, something piques your interest while you're researching. But the third one was a complete switch, and it was the biography of the Earl of Cardigan, the homicidal Earl, which was, you know, a direct quote from a newspaper. That's what he was known as by the British press in the 1830s.
You know, you read his appearance in Flashman and the like, and you keep thinking, this must be exaggeration, until you read the history, and then you think, no, he really was like this. And
I interviewed George MacDonald Fraser many years later, and you know, was absolutely fascinated to ask him about, you know, his sources and where he got all his material from. And I also mentioned that, you know, as a bit of homage, effectively, I had included Flashman. I'd referred to Flashman in at least 2 of my history books, possibly 3. He certainly comes into the homicidal Earl. He's also in the Indian Mutiny and Victoria's Wars. He would have been in Zulu, but he never actually writes the Flashman.
No, there's just that short story, isn't there, with a couple of pages on it.
But he was distinctly underwhelmed at the possibility that, you know, this may have, you know, he was much more interested in protecting his copyright. And actually, you need to be careful what you write about Flashman. You know, other people have tried, but nevertheless, that was the origin of the story. And I just as a bit of amusement, but I was also fascinated to hear from him confirmation of the story that he was written to by American academics when the book first came out. I think in the late 60s or early 70s. You know, could we see the original Flashman papers? Because we're doing a PhD on something, and this would be tremendously useful.
My own homage to Flashman is I've just written a novel of a Roman senator, or at least a chap who's made a senator by Julius Caesar and then thrown out of the Senate by Augustus, where he does this purge. He chucks out nearly 200 people as being unsuitable. And I worked out that the age you could be then, you could actually meet everybody important in the late Republic. So it's not the same character, but it's this rather dubious individual, and it's told first person. So I'm having a go at seeing, I know it won't be as good, but that's my tribute in a sense. But I've put an introduction pretending this is a papyrus from Herculaneum and all this sort of thing. And I'm wondering, it's only in draft, my editor hasn't even seen it yet, whether actually that's a bit risky because of writing the non-fiction as well, whether that even, you know, increases the chance that people will think this is real rather than
well, but in a funny way though, that all well and good in the end, because the you know, it can all come out in the wash at some point. You can have a good laugh about it, Adrian, and it'll be an interesting point possibly for the press to pick up on too. So, you know, all good in my opinion.
So what's the difference between doing, say, a 19th century set book to Second World War one, or the First World War another, in terms of approach? And because obviously there's a distance to the society, but also you're certainly not got any eyewitnesses around to talk to. So how does it vary much, or do you basically approach them in the same way?
Well, some things are very similar and some are very different. I mean, interestingly enough, when I moved from writing about the Second World War to writing about the Victorian period in the mid-1990s, I couldn't have been happier, because actually I'd found the business of interviewing participants incredibly emotionally draining, which in some sense is a good thing. You know, I'm not completely heartless to all the stories that I was hearing, but I found it incredibly draining. Logistically, of course, it took an awful lot of time. And what I then had working in the Victorian period is, yes, a foreign country to a certain extent, but people's human motivation doesn't change that much. I think both of us can agree with that. Where the whole point about the interesting business about historical fiction is that you can, I remember very brilliant editor who's now retired called Nick Sayers saying to me, and he'd edited a lot of the best historical fiction writers like Bernard Cornwell and Philippa Gregory, and he said to me, he said, you should be able to transfer your plot to any period of history. I mean, obviously you've got to change some of the details to make things vaguely credible, but basically this is about human nature, and it's about human interaction and motivation and the seven sins and all of that. And so I absolutely felt that, of course, you need to get your head around the fact that the 19th century is a time when religion, for example, has a much more powerful hold on everyone, and therefore plays a part in motivation. But as far as the sources were concerned, it was an incredibly rich period. Well, you will know that, of course, Adrian. I mean, particularly the ordinary soldiers really beginning to write for the first time. This particularly comes into play towards the end of the 19th century, but you can already see it through the middle of the 19th century and sort of post-Waterloo, where the sources are sort of solid, but still relatively sketchy compared to, the global conflict of the First or Second World Wars. Many more sources are becoming available. And the other great advantage I had, particularly writing follow-up books to the Cardigan book, which was the Indian Mutiny, Zulu and Victoria's Wars, particularly the two set in India, is that when you're dealing with the East India Company, this is an enormous bureaucracy which has kept a voluminous amount of paper in terms of official business, but also unofficial. Lots of fascinating reports done on conflicts and eyewitness accounts kept. I mean, really, still to this day, I think it's a great untapped resource, the Oriental and India Office collection, as it used to be known. I don't know if it's still called that, but it was when I was working in the what had been the East India Company Library, and then that was deposited in the British Library. So still a lot of wonderful material, but without the need to actually go and find people and interview them and tape them and transcribe those things. So a lot of things would be already beginning to sort of improve in terms of my research process and the amount of time it would take me moving over to the Victorian period. And when I did come back to the 20th century, which was computers, personal computers, and more importantly, the internet, which, needless to say, it goes without saying, was a huge game changer, not just showing you where you could find things, but ultimately, and particularly the case now, the digitization of a lot of primary material, which of course saves time and saves travel. In some tiny way, just as a quick caveat to that, it's sometimes a shame that you don't have to go to all these places, because in that sense, it's a bit of an equalizer and anyone can get hold of the material.
For the Roman period and earlier that simply doesn't exist. You get a few glimpses from the odd papyrus or this sort of thing, but that wonder. I even remember when I was doing my doctorate, I was writing a section on logistics and supply within the Roman army, and I had a reader's card at the National Army Museum at the time, and just going through the list and thinking, well, a mule is a mule. Ultimately, it's going to carry the same sort of weight and all this sort of thing. And I came up with it was one of the original ones printed in 1878 for Chelmsford's army, basically talking about how much you can fit on a wagon, how fast it will go, what forage it will need, how much graze, all this sort of, wonderful material. And that you don't get that immediacy in the ancient world in the same way. I mean, you can see it a little bit. They had in the Legion exhibition at the BM last year or the year before, they had papyri out there, but to be honest, just looking at it, unless you really know what you're looking at, it's just a lot of scrolls. And there isn't, and again, it's the context in that you'll have one or two glimpses of something. You won't have all the other people talking about the same sort of thing to say, well, is this typical? Is this standard practice, or is this some peculiarity of this particular thing? So it's, yes, it's all the stuff you'd kill for, basically. And when I've done fiction in more modern periods, it's wonderful to have that and just think you've got all the diaries, the memoirs, and all this sort of stuff. So let's see what's so there's a difference, but how do you choose? I mean, the last few have, I think, all been, well, there was the SBS one, wasn't there? And there's but mostly Second World War, and there was some First World War ones as well. as well.
One First World War,
Oh, was it?
to rather cynically timed to coincide with the 100th anniversary. I had always intended to write about the First World War. I was having a fascinating chat with my former editor at Penguin, Elio Gordon, who edited a lot of military historians over the years, including Anthony Beaver, but also interestingly Lynn MacDonald, whose books I loved, all the oral history of Lynn MacDonald. And so actually from reading her books, I was always intending to turn to the First World War at some stage, and wrote a number of proposals that were much more ambitious than the one I eventually did. And it was a real shame that was an anniversary book, tell the story of the First World War in 100 snapshots, basically, which is a bit of a gimmick book, but it was also allowed me to unfold I mean, I shouldn't say that because I'm sure some people listening or watching, sorry, might have enjoyed that book. But it was a book I took very seriously, as I do all my books, and yet it didn't require any original research because I didn't have time, to be truthful. It was I had to look at a lot of the best secondary sources and
there's always the book you can imagine in your head that would be perfect for you, and you would allow you to say, oh, I could talk about this, I could talk about that. And well, it's like the Victoria's Wars, there isn't going to be the space, there isn't going to be the time, and all this sort of thing. So so it's mostly Second World War at the moment. One of the difference that struck me as a reader is that in the past, one of the earlier ones, when an individual features a lot and you have a lot of comments from this, you were fairly confident they survived. Whereas now it's sometimes coming from letters or diaries, and it can be a bit of a shock when you get to chapter 20 and so was killed by mortar fire or something on this particular day. So how does that change work? You've talked a little bit about it before, but that difference between, given that the Second World War generation has virtually gone, and certainly there's nobody left of high rank. Even battalion commanders aren't around anymore, let alone you think of a documentary series like The World at War, where the interviews with Dönitz and people like this who must have been getting on then, and Horrocks and others. Exactly. All, and they're gone. We've got. Is that easier? I mean, you've talked about the emotional toll, which again, I'm sure that must be true. Again, it's something you'd never get with the ancient world because obviously it's long dead and gone. But is there a difference in how you use? Did you feel when you'd interviewed someone you had to be respectful, I suppose is perhaps the word, but you couldn't sort of say, well, I'm not quite sure whether this is right or not. This is what he thought. This is the story he heard. This is opinion. Or do you treat it in exactly the same way, even though it's just a written? Because obviously they've got family and children and the like.
I did, to be truthful, make that calculation. I was always doing it as I was, had someone in front of me. I think some instinct, clicks in, and you just, of course, you weren't there at all these little incidents, and some of them are unverifiable, but some stories just don't ring true. And I think the reality, again, this comes back to human nature, Adrian, is that the incredibly brave person is almost invariably over modest. So as soon as anyone boasts about anything in wartime, which let's face it is about as grim a circumstance as you can find yourself in the course of life, the alarm bells automatically go up. So I think to sort of answer your question more generally, it's been really interesting to me to realize yes, there's no one left from the Second World War, but that is not a bad thing for two reasons. I think people who you interview for 30, 40, 50 years later, you've already got a problem, really. The idea is that certain events are fixed in their minds. They will have read, particularly the people who've read a lot of history, because they often do that to try and sort of make some sense of what they've been through, and they start to conflate other people's stories with their own stories. So I began to increasingly rely, not invariably, or not entirely, but increasingly on more contemporaneous documents. So documents like, as you say, diaries and letters, but also some of the official stuff that's going on at the time. So Monty, for example, I've just been writing about the sequence of events leading up to Arnhem. And of course, he's having a lot of exchanges with Eisenhower, and you can see the written version of all those exchanges. I mean, we've got copies of all of that. So yes, even with that, you've got to read between the lines to a certain extent, but it does mean that I am much less reliant on someone saying 20 or 30 years later. And by the way, this includes, and it is a bit of a problem, but this includes a lot of the really good German material, like, for example, Guderian's memoirs, Speer's, a lot of the things that he wrote about after the Second World War, because you did have a generation of Germans who were trying to exculpate themselves. And all of them, Speer in particular, were deeply implicated, if they'd served the Nazi regime, particularly as senior generals. It's why I still feel ambivalent, to be truthful, about Rommel. I mean, until the war really looks like it's going to be lost, Rommel certainly never suggests, unlike someone like Stauffenberg, who, maybe by 1942 is beginning to realize, hold on, there's something, really dark at the heart of this regime. And for moral reasons, I've got to turn against it. I don't think Rommel ever turns against the Nazi regime for moral reasons. He turns against it because he can see Hitler losing the war, and there may be a way out of it. There may be a way to stop the whole thing come crashing down. And it's interesting, of course, he's forced to commit suicide, but Rommel almost certainly is not involved in the actual bomb plot. I mean, he writes, or certainly tells his family, I don't believe killing Hitler is the solution. So he will never go that far. He's quite glad to see the back of the Nazi regime by 1944, because he can see what's coming next, but he won't take the ultimate step to be involved in the assassination attempt.
I suppose, again, you've got to see all these people in context, the lives they've lived up to that point, and this tradition of, obedience and duty, and the ability not to see things or not to think about things you don't want to think about, because they're a bit of it, and just focus on the yes, I mean, it is that oddity, is that it really, once we're losing the war, that they start thinking, oh yeah, maybe this wasn't such a great idea. But it's another thing. I mean, I remember encountering a bit is I suppose it's from the 50s onwards, but when they're getting former German officers to write accounts of campaigns, in a sense, NATO wants to hear that the Wehrmacht was great at everything.
Yeah.
And they're happy to say that, oh yes, we would have won had it not been for this incompetent at the top. Oh yes, he was evil as well, but he didn't know what he was doing and all that. So again, it's, as you say, it's time passes, people have time to think about it, and something that is written close to events is bound to be more accurate, even for the things, okay, there'll be things they don't know, but they couldn't possibly have known at the time, whereas they don't. But you get that even, looking at the Napoleonic stuff, when I was doing those novels, Napier's history comes out 20 years or so after the Peninsular War, and then all the memoirs written subsequently, a very high proportion, if they don't just quote it, but there's always that sense that it's shaped how they're thinking and how they understand their role in, as you say, something that must have been so confusing in other respects. So yes, I mean, it's I think there's a definite change in tone with everybody's work. This is an outside look at it over the last decade or so. Is that really the time period where it started to change, where there are now so few left that, and people are willing to point out where the Allies make mistakes and do things that don't work. But for a while you had, I think it's a great book in terms of style, but Max Hastings' Overlord, for instance, where, it's the all singing, all dancing Wehrmacht that can do everything right and the Allies can do nothing right. And I didn't buy it then, even though I love the way that he and you can weave together the high politics, the Eisenhowers, the Churchills, the Roosevelts, and the Joe Bloggs in his split trench into the same story and put it all together. It's again something you can't do for the ancient world. It simply doesn't exist. I think you probably could for the Peninsular War, but I don't think anybody's done it yet. Not certainly as an overall thing. But it's a reflection of that increased literacy, I suppose, and that tendency where you go from, there were just more Victorians writing till you get to the First World War, and nearly everybody seems to be writing something or other, even if it's just basic letters home. So how do you come to a topic? How do you choose what's going to be next in terms of what you'd like to do?
Well, I mean, in the early days, as I've explained, the initial idea, well, actually, funny enough, going back to the very first book I didn't mention was, so how did I pick on the Highland Division? Well, of course, I knew about Dunkirk and I knew about a lot of other key moments in the Second World War. But again, round the dinner table, but I was a little bit older by this point, probably in my early 20s, my stepmother's father had served in the original Highland Division. He was captured. So he'd tell me all these stories about how the drama of the campaign unfolded. And I was like, crikey, I had no idea. And he also promised to put me in touch with a lot of people. So he opened a lot of doors. As a quick codicil to that, fascinating when I looked at his actual personal story, because I don't think he was quite happy for me to talk about the possibility of writing this book. When I actually said, I'm really going to do it, I'm giving up my job as a journalist, I'm going to start researching and writing this book, he then began to withdraw back his cooperation a little bit. And it later turned out, I mean, I'm slightly embarrassed to admit this, because I did feel it put my stepmother in quite a tricky position, but it actually turned out that the story he'd been telling his family for years and years and years wasn't entirely accurate. Now, it wasn't entirely accurate because it was a change to what had actually happened. He did behave quite courageously, but not in the way he'd always said it had happened. And there were reasons for that. And that also struck me as quite interesting, that you can get people who are very happy to talk in very general terms, but as soon as you drill down into the specifics of what they actually got up to, a completely different story unfolds. And so this layer upon layer of myth, which is not really, we're not talking about Walter Mitty here. We're just talking about slightly adjusting the facts, which is very salutary for us, I think, as historians, Adrian, to realize that, this is what people do. And again, this underlines my point, when you're talking to people 30 or 40 or 50 years later, I've increasingly begun to question the relevance of all of that. But in any case, the original book about the Highlanders, well, some of them, of course, escaped and then served in the rejuvenated Highland Division. And it was from one of those that, of course, had done so well in the desert, not so well in Normandy. But one of those veterans said, you must have heard of the Mutiny at Salerno. So that's where the Mutiny at Salerno book came from. Then I switched over to the Victorian period, and one sort of story comes out of another. One's related to another, and chronologically they sort of unfolded. Victoria's wars, certainly. I always planned to write a book about the Zulu War at some stage, so that came off the back of working in that period. And then coming back to the Second World War was very interesting, actually, because the first book I wrote about World War II was really an unusual one for a British historian, particularly one who hadn't written that many books about the Second World War, and that was Crucible of Hell, which is about the story of Okinawa in 1945, really the end of the Second World War in the Pacific, and the reason the atomic bombs were dropped, or at least the sort of understanding of why that might have happened. And that was very much a kind of a sense of, I need to fill in the gap of my understanding of what was going on in the Second World War. I've got a sort of pretty solid basic understanding of what's going on in the Western theatre, but not the Pacific theatre, Western theatre and also India, but not the Pacific theatre. So it was an attempt to do that. And off the back of that, then came Devil Dogs, which is the story of a specific unit. And that's interesting, Adrian, going back to your earlier point about the jeopardy of introducing people into the story, because I knew if it was going to be a tightly focused little group, like a company, all the way through the Pacific War, not all of them were going to survive. And you had to set them up in a way that didn't give the game away. And the best way to do that, of course, is if you have letters and diaries, because the reader's never going to know, it's not going to be obvious. Whereas if you're quoting, I interviewed this guy, well, of course, they know he survived. So, and one of the interesting things about that book, quite apart from how powerful, personally, I found it writing it, because it is a very intimate story, and terrible things happen in the Pacific. And it really gives you a chance, as the reader, to sort of, immerse yourself in the sheer unfolding horror of war. Yes, so there's a little bit of downtime in Australia, but not a lot. And other than that, they are moving from one combat zone to another, and just by the end of it, just desperately trying to survive. I mean, it's really incredibly moving story, probably the most powerful book I've ever written, but written 20 years too late, because they'd already made the miniseries The Pacific, sadly. Otherwise, it might have been used as source material for that. Who knows?
Actually, funnily enough, because that's still on my list to read, because I read the Okinawa one back in the summer, and it did for me give that sense of pulling things together. You know, I knew little bits, and about Okinawa, you know, I'd read there's the famous memoir by, is it Eugene Sledge, With the
Eugene
Old
Sledge,
Breed,
yeah.
and that sort of, which is one of those desperately haunting books. When you've read
Yeah.
some of that, you think this is, and because he went on to become an English professor, it's very well written.
Yeah.
So I wanted to, was it different working on an American topic? I mean, Okinawa, there's a broader sense there are some British participants as well, but when you're looking at a US Marine Corps company, this is very much American of the Americans of the Americans. Is that different, or did you find it just as?
I personally didn't. I mean, obviously you've got to get all the terminology right, and there's lots. There are lots of rabbit holes you can go down, and lots of mistakes you can make because you don't know how things are referred to, and you don't know all the kind of the technical language that they use. But it is just another unit, and this goes back to my point. I mean, I don't think you'll be a better person to comment on this than me, Adrian. But is life for the grunt just the same in the Second World War, and maybe even now in Ukraine, that it was for the Roman legionnaire 2,000 years ago? I mean, my suspicion is yes. Now, of course, there are differences, but basically, this is a small group of men trying to fight and survive, and their motivations and their sort of daily experiences probably are not that dissimilar. So that was my personal feeling. Of course, people were endlessly trying to trip me up, and I know Americans were probably some a little bit put out that a Brit would be writing about their one of their storied units, as it were, because not only and funny enough, you mentioned Sledge. I mean, Sledge was one of the sources for the second book. And when I was writing Okinawa, although I do mention Sledge, I don't overquote him in that book because I knew I would need him. Well, anyway, there wasn't an excuse to do that because it wasn't as tightly focused, but I knew I would need him for the follow-up book, which was also going to include his time in Peleliu, which of course would have been missed out in the Okinawa story, and all those other people, of course, that had been in his unit before they got there. But the unit itself, the 3rd Battalion of the 5th Marines Regiment, is one of the great storied units of the still to this day they are famous. They fought with great credit, I suppose, is the best way of putting it, in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they're still known as one of their finest fighting units today. So there was a certain amount riding on it, in the sense that I knew people would look at this slightly askance. But did I have the confidence to do it? Absolutely, because I didn't really feel writing about American servicemen, or indeed if I was to write about German servicemen, it would be that different to writing about British servicemen.
I'm sure you're right, and that yes, there's differences in technology and all this sort of thing, but you go back through history, you do see there are common themes that come up, whether you are reading a memoir of a light infantryman in the Peninsular War, or as I say, we have to guess this for the Romans. You get little glimpses, you get little stories about them, but you suspect. And to be honest, even my own time in the OTC at Oxford, your priorities change from thinking, oh, isn't this exciting? Oh, an army truck. Oh, that's glamorous. To this is bumpy. This is uncomfortable. I'm wet. Yeah. I'm cold. When do I next eat? When do I next sleep? And moaning a lot to let off steam. And the one thing, and I think this runs through, I can't get on with novels that are set with a military theme where there's no sense of humor in it, because there just seems to be, and I from all I've seen, it's there. Yes, there are variations with the British humor, American humor, German humor, but it's just there. People had to laugh to get through this because so much is so terrible that it's letting off steam. So I think that there's an element where if your soldier characters are always very po-faced, they don't come across as real to me in the same way. So, right. Well, as I say, I must confess, that's one of the ones that's on my list, because I thought, oh, that'd be interesting, but I wanted the overview first, and it joined things together and linked things in terms of the time scale. We all know about the Manhattan Project. We know about the eventual droppings of the 2 bombs. We know broadly about Okinawa. We know there's a sense, well, there are other things going on in the Pacific as well, but fitting it all together. And I would say the same thing if we come on now to Tunisgrad, that came out this year, which is about the Tunisian campaign, 42 to 43. Again, I'd read quite a bit, but it tended to be about specific battles, or more often specific individuals or units. So there's quite a bit, for instance, in Winged Warriors about the airborne component, the parachute brigade. as I mentioned, we were talking about this. My own father was an apprentice in the Merchant Navy. I'm not quite sure at what stage his ship got to Tunisia, but he talked about going ashore afterwards and liberating a German motorcycle and taking this for a joyride past mile after mile of Axis equipment. But the thing that really struck me this time is the aircraft with the bent propellers, that all this stuff destroyed, all this stuff captured. And what I loved about the book is that it did bring it together. I'd read the Rick Atkinson one, which, as you say, is very good on the American side, but not quite the broader. But this is everybody. It's the German side, it's the Allied side, it's the French side, it's the British and American, and the different groups. And I think the one thing that jumped out at me more than anything else was the scale of it all, in terms of distances, and then the relatively small numbers of troops involved, particularly early on, where you've got brigades doing things that, you know, you'd think in Northwest Europe would be a division or a corps or more.
Yeah.
And suddenly it's these critical actions are actually being decided by quite small numbers of people on the scale of the Second World War. And yet the whole thing comes together into this really big cataclysmic event for the Axis that doesn't really get the attention it deserves because Stalingrad's more dramatic and there are films made about that. Whereas, I don't know, there's barely anything has ever been made about Tunisia, and there's one or two.
No, the Desert Fox. Funny enough, I was asked a question about this. What's my favorite film about the Desert War? And I thought, well, there aren't many, but you know, the Casablanca, of course, doesn't directly deal with Operation Torch, but it kind of leads you into the whole experience in Vichy France. So that's quite interesting if people want to go down that track. But the other one, of course, is the Desert Fox, and I'm pretty sure in the Desert Fox it does deal with Kasserine, probably not that accurately. But the fascinating thing about Kasserine, because it's known as a tremendous American disaster, and what I was trying to do in the book is say, well, you know, the big sort of you know, the big splash story is, yes, they lost the pass, yes, the troops defending it cracked and ran, and that's never a good look on a battlefield, but sometimes that happens, particularly when you've been defending, again, you can go back to the Napoleonic period, or I'm sure Roman warfare. They're fighting stoutly, and then suddenly everything disintegrates, and that's just war. I'm afraid that doesn't mean you've got a bunch of people who don't know what they're doing, or they're frightened, or they're inexperienced, although they will be all of those things. So I wanted to show in that single incident about Kasserine Pass that, one, actually they'd fought quite well for a considerable period of time, and secondly, this so-called disaster and great victory of Rommel's, the last great victory he wins, was not really anything of the kind. Yes, he had some, you know, some ambitious plans which were scuppered, he says, because his commanders overruled him. But was it really just, you know, a plan that was never going to succeed anyway? And in any case, they retook the pass 2 or 3 days later, after very stoutly defending Rommel once he got through the pass. So there were opportunities in a micro sense to say something interesting and new during that book, but it was the big picture I was chiefly interested in, Adrian, which you've already mentioned, which is, why is it that something that you know, Churchill was talking about to the US joint session of Congress just a couple of weeks later as one of the, you know, the big moments of the Second World War, has never really been recognized as such? And yes, you're right, Stalingrad, of course, is perceived to be much bigger. And in terms of scale, you know, the millions of soldiers fighting on the Eastern Front, of course, North Africa is always dwarfed by that. It's the consequences, what this does for Hitler psychologically, but also the loss of, you know, the whole Southern Front gets opened up. He's got to devote an awful lot of troops to defending Southern Europe. And they're constantly preoccupied by this for the rest of the Second World War. I mean, I'm working on all of this at the moment, and you can see whenever there's a discussion about the Eastern Front, it's like, yeah, there's always a perception we can and will be able to deal with the Eastern Front. Just let us deal with the Western Front first. And you know, and people often ask, why Ardennes? What on earth is he thinking? And that absolutely plays into the same mindset. The Eastern Front is not really a threat. The Untermenschen on the Eastern Front, we can deal with them when we're allowed to concentrate on them. We just got to, you know, we've got to handle the Western Alliance first. And of course, that's not going to be possible.
Balancing act when you're writing about Hitler and the high command there in terms of how they're seeing things, because again, it's dangerous to fall into what we were talking about earlier, where post-war everybody's saying, oh no, we should have done this. In the same way, I must confess, I hadn't realized that Rommel had these far more ambitious plans for his offensive in early 43 than the right. And as you say, would it have worked or not? You can't help thinking probably not as dramatically or as well as he thinks. And it's the same as the race to the wire and some of the early things in the Western Desert, where he goes hell for leather thinking, oh, I can get to Egypt, and ends up losing half the Africa Corps tanks in a few days and running out of fuel and having to come back eventually or being overextended. It's that ambition of it all. But is it harder writing about how, because it obviously is vital how Hitler is thinking, but it's also the broader context of the general staff and how their planning works, and the practicalities of how they can move troops into Italy to take over when Italy changes side relatively easily, but it's because the distances aren't quite the same, and the transport networks is better as well compared to the East, even after several years of the war on the Eastern Front. But is that a particular challenge, or is that easy to do?
No, I think it is a particular challenge because, again, you're questioning the sources. I mean, we do have, by the way, I'm sure you know, Adrian, some wonderful sources about Hitler's headquarters. People like Warlemont, who was deputy chief of operations. So basically, he was there at all the senior planning up until the time that he gets properly ill as a result of being injured in the bomb plot in late August 1944, when he's effectively put out to grass, although he keeps his ear to the ground and he sort of knows what's going on. But what's brilliant about Warlemont's memoirs are not so much his account, which was written 20 years later or 15 years later, although that's good, that's solid, and that is verifiable. It's when he includes extracts from conversations, literally as they happened at the time, and that's much more interesting to me. So this is a readout, basically, which they would have kept notes of various crucial meetings, and it's incredibly revealing. And it's also very interesting how infrequently, I've certainly seen those quoted very infrequently, and then you get very good accounts like the Luftwaffe liaison officer at headquarters, who's also gets wounded, as indeed everyone does pretty much in the bomb plot. So he's there all the way through. Von Bello, Nicholas von Bello, and again, that is a source that the finest biographer of Hitler, Ian Kershaw, always says is he quotes it very much, and his sort of seal of approval meant that I thought, okay, this is pretty reliable. If Ian Kershaw thinks it is, then it probably is. But nevertheless, the contemporaneous stuff is the stuff that I would rely on more, and there's less of that. So people talking about what they might have done or what they would have done, and you mentioned before, a lot of work was done in the 50s. I mean, the famous book From the Other Side, I think it was called, Other Side of the Hill, sorry, which was a series of interviews with senior German commanders in the 1950s, which you would have thought would be gold dust. And there is some really interesting stuff in there, but there's also a lot of instances, as you've also already mentioned, of people saying, well, actually, it was all down to Hitler's incompetence, and we could have really been much more successful. I don't believe that for a minute. I think once just to take a date, once the Western Allies have made their secure lodgment on D-Day, it's all up for the Germans on the Western Front, and therefore it's all up for them, full stop. It's just a question of where they're going to concentrate their forces. And what's still a mystery to me, although I've given you some of the reasons why I think they did it, is why they didn't make more of an effort to hold the line further east and effectively allow the Western Allies an easier run. Because of course, in the sense post-war, that's going to be much more beneficial for Germany. But Hitler's not thinking in that way, is he? And his senior acolytes aren't thinking in that way either.
Democratic Germany afterwards, well, in the ashes of that, is just not the ashes are what counts. It's making so obviously on the German side you've got that, but then on the Allied side as well, of course, Tunisia you bring in, you've got Eisenhower, you've got Montgomery, you've got Bradley, you've got Patton. So many of these names, obviously they are all characters about whom people tend to have very strong opinions. So I mean, people will have very strong opinions about Caesar and Pompey and Augustus and Constantine and this sort of thing. Hannibal, often to a degree that's surprising. And I'm someone who does spend a lot of time thinking about all these people. But is that a hard one to write? And also, because this is really where, in a sense, most of them meet, or most of them have to deal with each other for the first time, and you've yet to have Sicily and then Northwest Europe and all the the tensions that will develop between some strong personalities. Is that, I mean, I felt it was very good in the sense that I did feel I was reading about them then and not with all that hindsight. But is that very hard to achieve?
I think so. I mean, you know, we both know the trick to writing about history is to just stop in that moment and say, well, Rommel doesn't know that his plan to get all the way to the northern coast of Algeria is going to be successful. And you're absolutely right, Adrian. I did feel, you know, just to stop on that for a second, I did feel that his plan was unlikely to work. But then again, pretty much the whole of the German general staff didn't think for a minute that the sickle stroke in 1940 was going to work. And sometimes extraordinary things happen in war. I think, you know, everything had changed. Of course, the Western Allies had much better and more armor. They were used to dealing with that sort of attack, sort of psychologically. They understood it and they understood the way to oppose it. And I think for those reasons, they probably were going to stop it. But we do have to be careful assuming anything is inevitable in history, because you know, we constantly get reminded suddenly of some extraordinary event and everything turning on a sixpence. But to deal with the personalities, I mean, I find it fascinating. I mean, as I said to you before, my instinct was always never to believe what I'd read about people. So I never believed that Monty was as poor a commander, not as poor a commander, because a certain number of historians have been reasonably generous about him, but as overrated as it was suggested, and that Rommel was as good as he was. So my feeling about all of these commanders is I'm going to take you as I find you in this moment, and let's see how things turn out. So, you know, as you can see, the way I do it in the book, which is the obvious way to do it, is you give a character sketch of how they got to that point, and then you try and analyze what they do from that point onwards. And I'm continuing the story on into Northwest Europe, where almost all of these characters are senior players again. So on the Western Allied side, yes, there's tension. I mean, you can see there's tension in Tunisia. That tension is only going to get worse as far as Monty's concerned, but it wasn't to do with his abilities that was a problem. He was, as Ike acknowledges, you know, one of the finest battlefield commanders of the Second World War, if not the single finest battlefield commander. But he had other temperamental problems that made him incredibly difficult for people to get along with. And this is going to play into how he's perceived after the war. So, you know, I'd much prefer relying, just getting back to hammer home this point about contemporaneous stuff, Patton's diaries about what he's thinking at the time, than Bradley's memoirs, you know, A General's Life, which are written 10 or 15 years later, because you get the feeling that this is really what Patton was thinking at the time. And Bradley's account, I'm afraid, is like everybody's, is to a certain extent self-serving. But no, you know, to answer your question specifically, I find it incredibly exciting, actually, to deal with a lot of people who had these relatively fixed reputations and to question whether that was accurate or not. And although I haven't shifted enormously with any of them, I think there's enough nuance there for people to get a sort of slightly fresh appraisal on some, if not all of them.
There is a very human element in the way you write about them, that you sort of sense that this is Patton, he's getting on a bit in years, this is his sense of the last chance, I'll actually do what I've always wanted to do. And Montgomery, tired as well. When you know, this starts after El Alamein and the pursuit, and yes, people have criticized him for a slow pursuit, but he's not coming completely fresh. He hasn't had a rest. And Eisenhower, I mean, I always feel when I read about him, sorry for the poor man in the sense of having to deal with all these people and trying to keep everybody happy. And I have a soft spot for him in a sense that you feel he was the perfect man for the job he comes to fill.
Totally
in that
he does, interesting enough though, Adrian, as I point out in Tunisgrad and also in the current book I'm working on, so he does want to find out, which every general does, even a general who's a brilliant, you know, administrator, and Alan Brooke, you know, what would it really have been like to have commanded armies in the field, and he does want to know that, and he sort of gives it a bit of a go in Tunisia, and it doesn't work out that well, and it's very clear, not just to his military bosses, but also the politicians, that actually it would be beneficial if he's moved upstairs and you bring in Alexander, who has a little bit more acumen, a little bit more strategic acumen. Although, as you can see, pretty much everyone criticizes everyone else in that campaign. And maybe that's just the business of soldiering. If you're a senior commander, you never say, well, you know, the guy on the same rank as me or one step up is brilliant. You know, why would you say that?
Yes.
Because,
oh, exactly.
They're going to stay in their job if that's the case. So there seems to be this sort of, you know, willingness among all of them, Bradley included. Bradley's always seen as a nice guy, whereas Patton's seen as the irascible, difficult one. But actually, Bradley was just as tricky a customer. And I think if you get to senior command, you have to have that element of ruthlessness and the ability to, you know, politic a bit. You could say Patton's great failing was he wasn't very good at politicking, saying the right thing to the right people. And on that subject, by the way, a couple of people have said to me recently, since they read Tunisgrad, whatever happened to Robinette? And that was Robinette's problem. So he's that tank commander who is actually very good, rejuvenates Combat Command B, which is a part of the US 1st Armored Division, but you never see him again in the end for the rest of the Second World War, because he basically is outspoken and he ruffles too many feathers. And you can only do that if you've got to senior command and you're seen a little bit like Patton was by Ike as indispensable.
Training posts or something for the rest of the war? It made me wonder, what does happen to Robinette? Does he...
well, he gets badly wounded at the end of the Tunisgrad
yes, I know
campaign, and he's effectively given staff, and he's given command duties. I think I'm pretty sure he definitely commands the armored sort of training center back in the US, and I think they give him an armored division. They may even give him a corps, but he's never given another combat command, which of course is what everyone wants.
So you've mentioned a few times what you're working on at the moment. Can you tell us a bit about that?
I can, yes, but mainly because I won't be letting any secrets out of the bag, because I've mentioned it on social media on more than one occasion, Adrian, probably much to the fury of my publishers. I don't know what their mindset is on these things these days. You have to be a little bit careful. I have occasionally spoken too much about a current project and someone else is working on it, and then they've kind of jumped in ahead of me to try and get the book out first. So you've got to be a little bit wary. But anyway, this one is such a broad canvas. I would, challenge anyone to try and attempt to finish it in the time I'm planning to. But in some ways, this is the final piece of the jigsaw for me, because I'm telling the story of the Second World War from the fall of Rome, which of course takes place a couple of days before D-Day, to the end of Berlin, but from the Italian, Western and Eastern fronts, which in that time scale and on that geographical spread has never been done before, believe it or not, although a lot of people have come close to that, including Max Hastings' Armageddon, which is from September. So he's already written this book about Normandy. So he doesn't reheat the old dish, although he could have done. And he doesn't deal with the Italian front either. And then Atkinson's written about that, but he doesn't deal with the Eastern front. And of course, Anthony Beevor's written about it, but it's just the Eastern front. So lots of people have done chunks of it, but no one's knitted it all together. And the title sort of says it all, going back to your point about, it's all going to end in disaster. Of course, it has to, is Twilight of the Gods, which, for listeners will know is the literal translation of Gotterdammerung, which was one of the Ring cycle, and that was Hitler's favorite opera. So he'd regularly attend, performances of Twilight of the Gods, and the sort of theme of the opera is, this kind of mythical Teutonic warrior eventually going down in flames, with the idea that that's how you regenerate yourself. It's almost sort of Clausewitzian in its kind of overtones, and I'm sure that's not a coincidence. Which is, if you're gonna lose a war, you go down fighting. You don't go down spinelessly, and only then can can your nation or your people be reborn. So that's how it ends. The fiery disaster at the finish of, and that seemed to be a perfect metaphor for the end of the Second World War in Europe. So it's Twilight of the Gods, Battle for Europe.
Must be you're going to be covering in timescale if you're going from early June through. That's again. Well, I felt with Tunisgrad that it was the book I didn't know I needed until I read it, because it did just, and the same with the Okinawa one, it joined things together for me. and then added new stuff as well. But there was that sense of, so often things break down into particular stories and you just focus on that, in the same way that, you know, like many, the interest is often Arnhem, and it's partly going, I think I remember my father took us to see, my brother and I, to see Bridge Too Far when it first came out in the cinema, and I must have been about 8 or something like that. And then we pestered our parents so much that our mother had to go and take us the next night to see it again. So there's always been that Arnhem element there. And, you know, the huge screen, I think it's now rated a 15 or anything, but they obviously weren't bothered in those days. But I loved it. You know, it was all my Airfix kits having come to life on screen, and drama and all this. But when you look more broadly at the development of airborne troops, then lots of what happens there makes more sense. There is a tendency, in the same way you could say, if you look at the Zulu War, how much of that gets focused on Isandlwana Rorke's Drift and forgets everything else that's happening. Yeah. This is only one column, or one and part, you know, Durnford's the second one, I suppose. But and I think all of us, even those of us who write about history for a living, we can sometimes fall into that trap with some of your pet interests. You just go along this thing, and it's such a help when somebody actually says, well, step back, this is where it fits. The things have happened before, things will happen afterwards. So that's when's that due to be finished, and when are you likely
It'll be finished at the middle of next year, so available the year after. I'm well into writing it. I mean, this is, I mean, I'm a year and a half into the project now, so it'll be another 6 months to 6 to 9 months to complete it, and then all the fiddling around. But but obviously a very big subject. But it has allowed me. I mean, you already mentioned before my earlier book about airborne Sky Warriors, and you know, I tell the story of Arnhem in Sky Warriors, and that's very much out of the development of airborne and where they've got to and how they're now using them as strategic role. And I try as much as I can, you know, in the benefit of, you know, how many words I'm able to devote to it, to fit that into the bigger picture of what the Western Allies are thinking. And yet, until you see the really big picture, Arnhem doesn't make sense, or not, as the case may be. And so I think, you know, I'm quite excited to try and make sense of things like Ardennes and Arnhem in the context of this big picture, because it's not just a question of what the Western Allies are doing. I've already explained. They're thinking, that is the Western Allies, what are we doing here? What are we doing in Italy? What are we doing in the Pacific? And of course, what are the Russians doing, and how can we sort of, you know, coordinate or not? And then the political element of how far, you know, Monty's already talking about getting to Berlin. Yes, it's a prize to a certain extent, but people are beginning to think, you know, late 44, the war's not going to go on forever. Or of course, they think it'll end a lot sooner than it does. And we need to even vaguely consider about, you know, the consequences for Europe if the Soviets are allowed to get too deep into the continent. So all of those bigger pictures sort of come into play in the way that you probably wouldn't see them mentioned in a book that's specifically about Arnhem or the Ardennes. I know Anthony Beaver and other historians have tried, and you know, very successfully tried to set the bigger picture. But I think until you're knitting it all together in a single narrative, it's hard to do that. And in the context, you know, in that sense, of course, there will be the big meetings between Stalin, you know, so at some stage in the book, I'm going to have the meeting. You know, obviously Yalta's going to come into the story, but also the meeting in the end, the meetings, sorry, between Churchill and Stalin at the end of 1944. That was just the two of them, and then just before that, the meetings, I think it was in Washington, between Roosevelt and Churchill, and those are often sort of missed, you know, the significance. But the so-called percentages meeting, where Churchill says to Stalin, look, you know, Bulgaria, you can have 90% of the influence, but in Greece, we want 90% of the influence, and you can see this is all absolutely crucial for the post-war settlement. Yes, the Soviets aren't, you know, are totally untrustworthy, but it is interesting that as far as Greece is concerned, they do sort of, you know, stand off, as it were, when they could have actually tried and get much more involved, given the communist involvement there was in the uprising there. So all of that's very, very, very fascinating. And then the picture, as a result, as I started off by discussing, becomes much bigger than just the fighting. It becomes the politics and the diplomacy and the you know, and the impact on all the people in Europe as this horrendous conflagration is nearing its conclusion. And by the way, one of the really fascinating bits of detail I've got at the beginning of the book, Adrian, is how half of the Second World War's casualties are incurred in the last year of war. So half of all Germany's casualties are incurred in that period, half of all the Soviet Union's. Now, when I say half of all the war, I'm talking about half the European war's casualties are incurred in the last year of war. So it gets increasingly violent and increasingly destructive during this awful 12 months of fighting.
1918 is a lot bloodier than people tend to remember, because they think of the Somme and Verdun as futility and nothing is really achieved. But actually, the armies are bigger. And I remember looking at the Royal Flying Corps in bloody April in 1917 and seeing a list of their casualties. And then by 1918, those levels of casualties are normal. It's just the Air Force has got bigger and it's become the Royal Air Force and all that sort of thing. But it's again how these things are remembered, those certain events. You see these catastrophes earlier and you sort of forget, because everybody's, particularly since then, but as you say, even at the time, jumping to the end and thinking, oh, well, it's all over. But yes, is this the first time really you've written about the Eastern Front?
Yes, it is.
Yeah,
so this is my this is my crucible of hell, and I don't know if you're getting suspicious where all this is going, because when I was working on the proposal for Twilight of the Gods, I thought to myself, actually, if I'm going to do the end of the Second World War in Europe, and I've already done the end of the Second World War in the Pacific, yes, of course, there are gaps in my knowledge. But, you know, every historian who eventually goes for broke, there will be some gaps. So it seemed completely logical that I would follow this up with a single volume history of the Second World War. So that is next.
Right.
You know, obviously that's a little bit further down the track. But yeah, so the end of the Second World War, and you know, the reason Tunisgrad fits so neatly with Twilight of the Gods is, of course, you're missing out Sicily but you could sort of, you know, you sort of get that. It's the bigger picture that's so interesting, which is that if in 1943, as I presage, in Tunisgrad, they're going to remain in the Mediterranean, what's going to happen in 1944? Well, they're finally going to go for broke, and that's pretty much what's happening. So while on the one hand they come in the Western Front, they're marching up through Italy, which is the residue of the Mediterranean campaign. And you know, historians like James Holland have been tearing their hair out, people really not giving the Italian campaign the credit it deserves in terms of tying up German troops, the Foggia airfields, the destruction of the Plosti oil fields. You know, all of these things were real tangible results as far as the Italian campaign is concerned. So yeah, I mean, the broader picture in all of this is, or at least the broader theme of all of this, is that how certain aspects of a conflict get overdone and told, and their impact becomes even greater because other important bits of the jigsaw puzzle have been forgotten about. And I suppose it's so what I'm trying to do in both these books is allow you know, a lot of the relatively untold stories to come back into play so that we can see it, you know, as much more as a unified whole. Now, I know that's you know, that's ambitious. You'll never get there, but you can at least make an attempt to go somewhere down the track.
Always be something, the perspective of some individual, particularly those who don't survive, that's lost, and let alone all the things that nobody wrote down at all, even in comparatively recent history. I mean, I remember my father talking about doing his parachute training, because after he'd come out, he got double pneumonia, was invalided out of the Merchant Navy, was then old enough to get sent straight into the army. So was with the Cheshire Regiment after his basic training, driving a Carden Lloyd carrier, and suddenly posted to this airborne unit of the Royal Ordnance Corps, of all things. And there was the idea was they were going to be trained to drop if there was a unit surrounded to help repair vehicles, but they had to do the parachute training first. But he always said, and when we went to Duxford once in his later years, that he actually did his parachute jumps from a Ju-52, what he called a Fokker trimotor. And I'm guessing, I've never come across this, that this is probably because all the Dakotas and all had been busy with, well, first of all, you'd lost a lot for Market Garden, but then you had the Rhine crossing.
Yeah.
And I suspect he ended up in Palestine when the war ended, and he was there till late in the British Mandate, in the Ordnance Corps, and he couldn't remember which brigade division he was in, this sort of thing, repairing vehicles. And there's photographs of lots of comets and the Mark I Centurions and all this sort of stuff out there. But the thought, it's one of those things, I'll never have the time, and I probably don't know the right sources. I'd be interested to know if there's any record of these captured aircraft that I rather suspect they probably got from Tunisia or somewhere like that.
Yeah,
if they did have them, that simply they were that was what was there, but it was the sort of corrugated side was the thing he remembered because he was looking at this thing. And so, but again, one of those oddities of that's the only place, he's the only source I have for that. He's my father. I assume it was true. It made some sort of sense. It was an odd thing to claim if it wasn't true. But that sort of thing that could easily be lost in the records of the archives unless somebody happens to really go and look for it. And even then, it might not be something that is documented because they were simply getting on with the job and that's what they had available. Sorry, that's a digression into family history. So no, I'm very much looking forward to that because I think I do love the detail, and that's why the Devil Dogs is on my list, because to look at a particular unit and those individual experiences remind you that in the end we come back to these human beings that are living through this and coping somehow and managing and doing these extraordinary things or suffering these extraordinary things. But there is the reason why, as it were, which I suppose is bringing us back to Cardigan in a sense, isn't it? Via Tennyson, that of where it all fits and how the whole thing does come together, how this vast conflagration does actually, and I can't remember who it was pointed this out to me, but when you look at a lot of the German decisions, and particularly Hitler's decisions, although the assumptions on which he's acting are crazy by any standards, there is a logic if you accept that as true, that all of this is then, well, that's the next step you would take, wouldn't you? And this is how you succeed. So it's that bringing that to life of how different many of the assumptions were for people in charge, but then how much difference that made to how the events played out. Sorry, but just briefly back to the Eastern Front, and then I probably ought to let you go because we are going on a bit time-wise. Was that more of a challenge finding the material for that? Have you? Is it harder to understand? I mean, there's been a lot, and obviously Anthony Beevor and others since the fall of the Berlin Wall. There has been more information about the Soviet side of things that isn't so obviously propagandist. But is it still difficult to understand what they were really thinking, given that Stalin's level of control and the difficulties for lower level commanders?
We've got a fair bit of contemporaneous material about the conversations between the Russians and the British, about what the Russians were talking about among themselves. There are many brilliant accounts, or at least interesting accounts on the Russian side. You've got people like Catherine Meredale, who's wrote a really superb book, Ivan's War, about the experience for ordinary Russian soldiers, and you can knit that into the story. Is it going to have anything like the same rich tapestry that my knowledge and my familiarity with the Western sources will give me? Probably not. But one thing it has absolutely brought out is the similarity with the way the Russians are fighting now in Ukraine. So I'm doing a podcast on that, and literally discussing it every week on week, and the casualty lists and the brutality among the senior Russians towards their ordinary soldiers, and indeed the officers towards their ordinary soldiers. And none of the way a normal military efficient military system works makes any sense with the Russians, and yet that's exactly the same way they're fighting in the Second World War. You can still see the ruthlessness and the unthinking willingness to sacrifice enormous quantities of lives for this greater cause. The cause of the Soviet Union, the cause of communism, the cause of sort of international Bolshevism, but really was down to the people pulling the levers of power, just like it is today. So of course it's a different political regime. So it has allowed me to see lots of interesting parallels.
That's yes. And I'm sure there's no need for me to say that. And we're struck by the similarities of the Winter War as well. Of this sense of how you can mismanage something, but there's the sheer quantity that keeps you grinding along.
It's a very good analogy, Finland, actually. That is almost the best analogy that there is of what's happening in Ukraine at the moment. I think what might be a difference, we'll have to wait and see how this pans out, is the willingness of international support for Finland, which of course was there in words in the Second World War, but not really in any kind of practical sense. So we'll have to see how this turns out. But the analogy may well hold, given the way things are developing at the moment. We'll see.
Right. Well, anyway, I probably ought to let you go because I've gone over the time that I said I would. But it's just been lovely to talk and fascinating. And apart from, as I say, there were a couple that like the one about the Highland Division, which I've never read, and I need to, because I'd like to know more about that rather than a little bit. Devil Dogs is on the list anyway, and the next one as well, which is again the Twilight of the Gods. Is that the
Twilight of the Gods is
Twilight
yeah,
of the Gods? So that'll be
forthcoming.
18 months or so, 2 years. I can look forward to that. But anyway, thank you so much for coming on and having a chat. And well, just yes, that's probably how I should have finished in the first place, rather. But anyway, Saul, thanks very much for coming on, and it's been a great pleasure. And I hope you've had a bit of fun as well. And I know the viewers will, because it's the whole point of this channel is to try and talk about history and why we find it so fascinating. And if we don't find it fascinating and want to know more, then why should anybody read our stuff? In the end, it's a lot of fun to do, and I count myself very lucky that I've been able to make a career doing this with something that I enjoy so much and find so fascinating, and that you're still learning because you keep going on to a different topic and a new topic, and there are always things that had never occurred to you before, you hadn't come across, whether it's my period or more modern. So anyway, Saul, thanks so much for coming on.
Not at all. Thanks so much for asking me, Adrian. Great fun chatting to you. You know, you've highlighted a lot of things that I often thought about but never really put into words. So it's been a very useful conversation. Thank you.